Let's bring in chief political analyst Brit Hume, co-host of The Five and co-anchor of America's Newsroom, Dana Perino, and chief political anchor Bret Baier. How do you think that farewell address went, Brit?
Well, I think he did the best he could with what he had to work with, but it's a difficult situation because the public has clearly rejected his record. In fact, we had this poll out tonight of our own that showed that most people thought that the Trump victory was a token not so much of Trump's popularity, but of the disaffection with Joe Biden. So he was trying in part, I think, tonight to try to restore his image as someone who was an effective president. It's a hard sell, and it comes at a time when I think the public has largely tuned him out. He faded away in that debate that we all saw. Then he was gone, too late probably in the eyes of Democrats for them to mount an effective campaign for a new candidate, and lost the election decisively, not a landslide in the usual terms, but he lost decisively. And he's been elbowed out of the center of things now in all the weeks since the election. So I think this was an attempt, but I'd be surprised if the number of people watching it would match the kind of thing he might have hoped for.
This, Bret, did not seem to be a happy farewell. He seemed bitter about people who scorned him, perhaps Pelosi mentioning the stock trading ban that he never really pushed until he was betrayed by Nancy, blasting the oligarchs who kind of also, in his mind, betrayed him this past summer after he decided he wasn't going to run, or that decision was made for him. What did you make about these warnings?
Well, it's interesting, Jesse. He harkened back, as I mentioned, to President Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, talking about a military-industrial complex. He started talking about the threat from an oligarchy and the concentration of power and wealth having an impact on U.S. policy. You know, it's interesting that Democrats raised a lot more money and spent a lot more money on that election, almost 2-to-1 over the Trump campaign. And so there was a concentration of money on the Democratic side. It was just what they were selling was not selling to the American people. I thought, obviously he was trying to put rose-colored glasses on some of the things that the administration did. You have to give credit for a bipartisan effort on infrastructure and other things. There were real critics of a lot of those pieces of legislation, but he did push them through Congress. But you have to realize that the result of that election is a complete repudiation of going a totally different direction than the Biden administration and the Harris administration would have. And when he told USA Today that he still could have beaten Donald Trump, I think no one believed that after that June 27th debate.
Dana, are we looking at a failed presidency? This is a one-term guy. This is complete repudiation by the American people. 33% approval rating. Many people see this as a failure.
So you and I sit together every day on The Five, and you know that I try to be really nice. And I intended to find something that I could say, wow, that was great. So news of the day at the top, understandable. Big soaring attempt at a rhetorical push for unity. I'm like, okay, I'm following. And then, what in the world was he talking about? For example, when he talks about dark money, does he not remember that just last week he gave the Medal of Honor, or Medal of Freedom Award to George Soros? He talked about the fact that they had the biggest economic rebound than ever. He never mentioned COVID, which was the entire premise of his presidency. Today, I looked at a poll. Brit mentioned our poll. There was another poll, the Gallup poll. They asked about 18 issues. Which ones are you feeling better about? Only 1 out of 18 did people feel better about, and it was gay, lesbians, and trans issues. So he's sitting there talking about all of these things that he's done, and I'm just like, this rings hollow. To me, it felt like the speechwriters have already left the building and that they asked ChatGPT to write a speech for Joe Biden in which he doesn't remember that he was president for the last 4 years. If you ask people, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? The answer is no, except for maybe the solar companies and the Delta smelt.
That was mean, Dana. Wow, Brit Hume.
I tried.
Dana is meaner than you are. What is happening here?
Well, I'll answer the question you posed to her. whether this was a failed presidency. And I think the answer, sad to say, unmistakably, is yes, it is. It has failed on a number of counts. The first one being on foreign policy, beginning with the entirely problematic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think a great many people feel was the signal to Vladimir Putin and perhaps others that their aggression would be unmet by the kind of resistance they might once have expected. And that gave us the Ukraine war, the kind of on-again, off-again support for Israel, which was, ended up with the administration trying to beat its Middle East, only really solid Middle East ally into submission on and stopping the war. From the beginning of that conflict, begun by Hamas, the principal goal of this administration, even as Israel was plainly winning, was to stop the fighting. That now looks like it's come to pass at a very late stage in the game. But I don't think that was good foreign policy, and I don't think the signal it sent to the rest of the world was welcome either. And indeed, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, admitted recently that every time there was distance between the U.S. and Israel, as there was repeatedly, it got harder and harder to deal with Hamas on any kind of a peace resolution or a ceasefire. So, and then, of course, you never heard any discussion of the biggest problem Americans face day in and day out in their daily lives, and that was the extraordinary inflation that we endured in this country. And that was brought about, I think, in no small measure by the wild spending on top of the spending that had already happened at the beginning. That was at the beginning of this administration, and it continued, and everybody felt it, and still feels it to this day. So despite growth and a good stock market and all that, Americans do not like this economy.
All right. Man was living in his own world. Not a great listener like I am. That is for sure. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you all tomorrow on television. We really appreciate it. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.